Here is your cinematic YouTube documentary script for The Frighteners, 1996. Imagine a man who charges people money to remove ghosts from their homes, ghosts that he hired in the first place. That sentence alone should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of film The Frighteners wants to be. It is a movie that opens with a con artist, pivots into a murder mystery, descends into something genuinely dark and disturbing, and somehow manages to keep its sense of humor intact through most of the journey. Peter Jackson made this film in 1996, sandwiched between his early splatter comedies and the monumental weight of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And in many ways, it is the most interesting film of his career precisely because it doesn't fit cleanly into any category. It is too funny to be pure horror, too frightening to be pure comedy, too emotionally serious to be dismissed as a genre exercise. The Frighteners is a film that was misunderstood when it arrived, underseen in the years that followed, and is only now, decades later, beginning to receive the attention it always deserved. Michael J. Fox plays Frank Bannister, a man living at the intersection of tragedy and opportunism. He wasn't always this way. Once he was an architect. He had a wife. He had a future that looked like most people's futures, structured, forward-moving, lit with ordinary hope. Then a car accident destroyed all of it, took his wife, and left Frank with something he never asked for and can never turn off: the ability to see the dead. Not metaphorically, literally. The ghosts of people who haven't crossed over exist alongside Frank in the waking world, fully visible to him, conversational, sometimes demanding, occasionally petty, and always present. This is not portrayed as a gift. The film is careful about that. From the very first moments we spend with Frank, it is clear that this ability has cost him everything: his career, his social standing, his sense of belonging among the living. And rather than find meaning in it, he has chosen to monetize it in the most cynical way available to him. His operation works like this. Frank's ghost companions, 3 of them, each with their own distinct personality, haunt a house. The terrified homeowners call Frank, who arrives as a paranormal investigator and, for a fee, performs an exorcism that is entirely theatrical. The ghosts leave on cue. Frank pockets the money. It is a small, grubby con, and the film lets you find it funny without letting you forget that it is also a portrait of a man who has given up on himself. He lives in a half-finished house. He has no real relationships with the living. He drinks too much coffee and drives a hearse and wears a permanent expression of low-grade exhaustion. Fox plays this beautifully, bringing just enough of his natural warmth to keep Frank sympathetic, even when the character is at his most self-serving. You understand immediately why this man has retreated into this particular arrangement with the dead. The living have nothing left to offer him, and he has stopped trying to believe otherwise. The ghost trio around Frank are where the film's comedic engine lives. Cyrus, played by Chi McBride, is loud and charismatic, a 1970s-era soul man who moves through the afterlife with the energy of someone who has not yet accepted that the party ended. Stewart, played by Jim Fife, is nervy and prone to panic, the kind of person who was probably anxious in life and has brought that anxiety fully intact into death. And then there is the judge, played by John Astin, a gunslinger who drifted into Frank's orbit at some point and never quite explained why he stayed. Each of them has a comic texture, and Jackson uses them to inject levity into what would otherwise be a fairly bleak premise. The dynamic between Frank and his ghost crew has the rhythm of a sitcom at times: bickering, loyalty, negotiation, and the film earns its laughs from character rather than from broad slapstick. These are ghosts with interiority, and that specificity is what makes them amusing rather than cartoonish. But then the numbers start appearing on people's foreheads. This is where The Frighteners begins its tonal shift, and it is a shift that happens gradually enough that you almost don't notice you've left the comedy behind until you're already deep inside something much darker. Frank starts seeing digits carved into the foreheads of random people in his small New Zealand town, digits that turn out to be countdown numbers. And shortly after Frank sees them, those people die. The cause of death is always the same: cardiac arrest with no physical explanation. The local doctor, Lucy Linsky, played by Trini Alvarado, begins to sense that something connected to her recently deceased husband ties into these deaths, and she is drawn into Frank's orbit with a pull that has both practical and emotional momentum. The entity responsible is not one of Frank's ghosts. It is something else entirely, a dark shape that tears through walls and through bodies, leaving behind nothing but dead hearts and terror. The film visualizes this entity as a robed, skeletal figure moving at inhuman speed through wood and concrete and flesh, and the effect is genuinely unsettling. Jackson shot these sequences with a kinetic, aggressive camera style that feels completely different from the film's lighter moments, and that contrast is both a strength and a complication. When the Grim Reaper figure appears, the film shifts registers so completely that it can feel, for a moment, like you've been dropped into a different movie. A scarier one, a more merciless one. And the question of whether that tonal whiplash serves the story or disrupts it is something the film never entirely resolves. What The Frighteners does resolve, with considerable emotional intelligence, is Frank's internal landscape. As the murders escalate and Frank finds himself both investigating the killings and suspected of committing them, because naturally the man who keeps showing up near dead bodies becomes the prime suspect, the film begins excavating his grief in earnest. The accident that killed his wife was not simple. Frank carries guilt, not just loss, and that guilt is the real weight beneath all the cynicism and the ghost-based entrepreneurship. He has been punishing himself for years with a life deliberately kept small and joyless, as though suffering quietly is a form of penance. Lucy, who is herself navigating fresh grief over her husband's death, becomes the mirror that reflects this back to him, not through confrontation, but through proximity. Simply being around someone who is also learning to survive loss begins to crack Frank open in ways he hasn't allowed before. Trini Alvarado is excellent in a role that could have been purely functional. Lucy is not written as a love interest who exists only to motivate the male protagonist. She is grieving, curious, brave in a specific and unperformative way, and she refuses to be kept at arm's length even when Frank is doing his best to push her there. The gradual trust that develops between them is one of the film's quieter achievements. Built-in glances and hesitations and shared horror rather than in dramatic declarations. And it gives the story an emotional foundation that anchors its wilder genre elements. The film's mythology deepens considerably when the backstory of the supernatural killer begins to emerge. Without moving too far into the specifics, what is revealed is a history of real-world violence. A mass killing from decades earlier, a young woman named Patricia Bradley, and a relationship between the human and spiritual dimensions of evil that is more psychologically complex than the standard haunting narrative. Jake Busey plays a role in this history with a performance pitched at an intensity that borders on the operatic, and the film uses archival footage and memory sequences to build the weight of what happened before Frank ever arrived in this town. There is an implied argument here about how violence leaves psychic residue, about how trauma doesn't simply end with the people it first touches, but spreads outward into time, infecting the present through the people and places it marked. That is not a small idea for a film that also contains slapstick ghost antics. Dee Wallace and Jeffrey Combs appear in supporting roles that deserve specific attention. Combs, in particular, delivers one of the most committed comedic horror performances of the decade as Milton Dammers, an FBI agent who has investigated so many paranormal cases that he has been slowly, irreversibly unhinged by the experience. He is at once genuinely threatening and genuinely hilarious, a combination that requires precise calibration. And Combs hits the target with a consistency that makes every scene he's in feel like a small event. Dammers is suspicious of Frank, obsessive in his pursuit, and completely unmoored from normal human behavior in ways that the film plays for comedy without ever quite letting you relax around him. It is a technically demanding piece of character work wrapped inside what looks like scenery-chewing excess. Visually, Jackson and his team created something that still holds up with real authority. The town of Fairwater feels both ordinary and slightly wrong, the kind of place where normal life and supernatural intrusion exist in the same frame without either element acknowledging the other. The effects work, particularly the depictions of the ghosts moving through walls and the Grim Reaper entity tearing through physical space, was groundbreaking for its time and was in fact developed using techniques that Jackson's own Weta Digital operation helped pioneer. The CGI has aged in places, as 1990s digital effects inevitably do. But the underlying visual imagination hasn't aged at all. The way Frank's world is layered, the living on one plane, the dead on another, both visible simultaneously to the camera and to Frank, gives the film a textural richness that purely physical filmmaking of the era couldn't have achieved. The humor and the horror operate on parallel tracks for most of the film's running time, and for long stretches that parallel operation is a feature rather than a flaw. Jackson understands instinctively that comedy and fear share the same nervous system. Both produce a sudden, involuntary physical response. Both require precise timing. Both collapse if you overthink them. A joke can diffuse terror. Terror can make a joke land harder in retrospect. The film exploits that relationship with real skill during its middle section, using the Ghost Trio's comic energy to release tension just before the scenes involving the Grim Reaper figure rebuild it. It is structural storytelling through tonal alternation, and when it works beautifully. Where? The Frighteners' struggles is in maintaining consistent momentum across its full length. The investigation's subplot, which becomes increasingly prominent as the film moves toward its third act, occasionally bogs down an exposition that slows the pace without adding proportional emotional weight. The transition from the film's lighter, more comedic opening register into its genuinely frightening final passages creates a whiplash effect that some audiences found disorienting in 1996 and that remains a legitimate criticism today. Jackson is asking his audience to follow Frank through at least 3 distinct emotional registers: cynical comedy, supernatural thriller, dark psychological horror. And the connective tissue between those registers isn't always seamless. There are moments where the film seems to be straining against itself, unsure which version of the story it wants to be in the immediate present. Patricia Bradley, played by Dee Wallace, is a character whose full potential the film comes close to realizing but doesn't quite reach. She is central to the film's mythology and carries a quiet, suppressed menace throughout her earlier scenes. But the story's demands on her in the final act require emotional and psychological complexity that the screenplay hasn't fully invested in by that point. The payoff of her storyline lands, but it doesn't land as hard as it should. And that slight shortfall is noticeable in a film that otherwise earns most of its dramatic conclusions. The climax of The Frighteners takes Frank somewhere genuinely harrowing, across the boundary between life and death, in a sequence that the film has been building toward from its earliest scenes. The underworld that Jackson visualizes is not peaceful or abstract. It is a physical space with its own logic and its own terrors, and sending Frank there forces him into a confrontation not only with the supernatural evil the film has been pursuing, but with the core of his own guilt and his own grief. It is the moment the film has been earning, and it pays off with a clarity and an emotional directness that resolves both the plot and the character simultaneously. Frank doesn't escape his past by defeating a villain. He escapes it by choosing, actively and at genuine cost, to rejoin the living. That is a meaningful distinction. The themes running beneath The Frighteners are not subtle, but they are handled with more nuance than the film's genre classification might suggest. Death is not treated here as a dramatic device or a source of cheap shock. It is treated as a presence, omnipresent and democratic, touching every character in the story in ways both visible and hidden. The ghost characters are not there purely for comic relief. They are evidence that life ends imperfectly, that people die with unfinished business and unresolved feeling, and that the boundary between living and dead is more permeable and more intimate than we prefer to believe. Frank's ability to see ghosts is not a superpower. It is a condition. It keeps him in constant contact with loss in a way that has made ordinary living feel impossible. His arc is not about gaining power. It is about learning to release what the accident took from him so that he can stand again among the living without the weight of the dead pressing him down. Released in 1996 and marketed imperfectly, the trailers emphasized the horror elements in ways that alienated comedy audiences and the comedy elements in ways that alienated horror audiences. The Frighteners arrived without finding its crowd and departed from theaters quickly. Its reputation has been rebuilt slowly and entirely through home viewing, through word of mouth, through the gradual cultural recognition that what Peter Jackson made here was something genuinely singular. A film about grief that made you laugh, a film about fear that made you feel tenderness, a film about a man so exhausted by death that he forgot, for a long time, how to want to live. And then remembered. That is not a small story. Dressed in special effects and ghost comedy and small-town mystery, It is actually a story about the most universal thing in the world, the experience of loss that goes so deep it reshapes the person it happens to. Frank Bannister is not a hero at the beginning of The Frighteners. He is a survivor who has confused surviving with living. The film's greatest achievement is that by the time it ends, you have watched the distance between those two things close, and you have felt every step of that journey as if it belonged, at least a little, to you.